After an incredibly disappointing finish to their season, the Philadelphia Eagles, who lost 6 of their final 7 games, including a blowout, lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the wild card round, are sticking with their head coach, Nick Sirianni. However, they are moving on from both their offensive coordinator, Brian Johnson, and both their defensive coordinator, Sean Desai, and Matt Patricia. Which brings us to the question this organization needs to ask. How do you fix what happened? Today, with the help of my friends Nate Tice from The Athletic and Chris Long, former Eagles defensive lineman, I'm going to try to solve that. So let's dive in. All right, first, I am joined by my friend Nate Tice of The Athletic Football Show, Yahoo Sports, where you just wrote an excellent piece about the Eagles offense, sort of breaking down some of the problems, suggesting fixes, which is what we're going to get to. That's the point of that. One thing the Eagles saw or felt that they did not need to fix, or at least change, was their head coach, which seems obvious in some ways. He did take Philadelphia to the Super Bowl last year, but there was a lot of buzz about the team potentially parting ways with Sirianni after the offense faltered so dramatically last season. Nate, before we get into that offense and the problems and what can be done to fix it, what do you think about the decision to stick with Sirianni as head coach?
For a moment there, I thought Brian Dable was going to be the longest tenured NFC East head coach. I thought maybe it was the Eagles looked at the Cowboys and said, "Oh, you're keeping your guy? Okay, we will too. Let's just let's all run it back so we keep these familiar faces." It's hard to fault, winning the division several times last year, winning the conference last year, making the playoffs 3 years in a row, double-digit wins, still having a good offense despite some of the faults that have happened. But I think it's a look in the mirror. Let's not shake it up. Let's keep this thing going. Let's keep the same. We're already losing a guy like Jason Kelsey, most likely. So let's not shake up everything that we have on this team. We need more familiarity. We need more continuity. And I think that's the decision here. It's like, hey, let's revamp. Let's make the changes we need to make. And the guy at the top is the start of that.
Well, let's talk about that offense and what needs to be changed. First, let's start with the schematic aspects of it, which you got into in your excellent piece on Yahoo Sports. People should check it out, where you broke down the many reasons why the Eagles offense struggled this year. I'll do my best to summarize some of them. It starts with something that I've talked about a lot on my show, which is Jalen Hurts not being as dynamic of a runner. You broke out some of the numbers. They're pretty glaring. And yeah, Nate, that affected everything they do, because so much of what made this offense successful last year, including, of course, the tush push, but beyond that, was predicated on the idea that they had a numbers advantage compared to most offenses because their quarterback was a threat to take off. The RPO game suffered. Some of it was that because of Hurts's running, some of it was predictability. And then I would say, and this is something I've also talked about a lot, defenses played them differently. They saw a lot more split safety coverages, yes, A.J. Brown not getting those tasty one-on-one matchups. So these are all of the issues. I guess let's start there. And then, I should add, of course, Jalen Hurts not being able to solve the blitz. That was the major problem. So,
but other than that, how was the play, Mrs.
Yeah, right. So it's a lot. It's a lot. So, but let's. So you laid out all of these problems. Let's get to solutions. And I realize it's going to take a lot because I laid out a lot of things. But again, from a play calling perspective, how do you go about solving some of those problems so that they don't persist into next year?
The Eagles really was striking, and then this year too, there was some beauty in the simplicity of their offense. Yeah. Like, just they run 7 plays, stop them. And it was kind of cool and kind of frustrating, I'm sure, for some opposing fans, where they're like, they're running the same thing. Yeah. Stop it. But it's A.J. Brown, Dallas Goedert, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Hurts running all over you. If you watch even just what the Colts do with Steichen, who runs a very similar offense, ton of 11 personnel, no motion, ton of the same formation, same concepts, is that he just turns the dials just a little bit different. They run the RPOs, but they switch up the combos that they run. They don't just run the same slant flat thing. They run 4 different varieties of that. That to me is the simplest answer, because I think Jalen Hurts is going to always kind of need the RPO game to kind of live in a functional offense. I think that has to be a component of whatever offense he's in. But if you just keep running the same play over and over, the NFL is going to figure it out. So I think first and foremost, they evolve that RPO part aspect of the game. Also, just Hurts as a runner was just less effective. And I'm not sure what it is. Some of that RPO stuff is some of it, some quote unquote being solved. I thought there's a few times where he was making poor decisions as far as the pulls, as far as when he kept the ball or when he decided to throw the ball in those RPOs. So I think some of that, and that just was reflected in the stats. Again, he went from one of the better runners, one of the most effective designed runners, to one of the worst last year. In fact, basically, he was only better than Russell Wilson and Daniel Jones. Those were like the two runners that he was better than. He only forced 3 missed tackles this whole year. Last year, he forced a missed tackle on 22% of the time he touched the ball, which is, dozens of times. So it's just, I know. And I don't know if, again, there's some scheme stuff with that, but he just didn't seem willing, or seemed sometimes when he did decide to do it, it was more like, hey, I'm trying to make something happen here. Hopefully something works.
So this year, the offensive coordinator, who was his quarterback's coach, Brian Johnson, kind of hit copy paste on the playbook from last year. You alluded to this, and it didn't work anymore. And I would characterize this offense as oversimplification as a power spread offense, which, by the way, is pretty unusual in today's NFL. Yep. What the Eagles do is unique. Next year, do you feel we're talking about, they got to get better RPOs, they got to get better against the blitz, got to get Jalen Hurts moving again. Those are kind of individual discrete things, but the total picture, do you think schematically they need to evolve away from what they've been the last 2 years? And as you look across the NFL, are there any offenses you think they might borrow from or sort of lean into, if not outright, go in a different direction?
Actually, one would be, what I would look at what Lamar has been in Baltimore and some of the QB run game there. And not even just with Monken, what he did under Greg Roman. Yeah. And I have my faults with Greg Roman, but some of that QB run game stuff was good. And I think this always has to be an aspect with Hurts until he becomes more consistent working from the pocket. Right now, the blitz stuff heats him up, makes him get off script. And that's not what you want. You want to be on script with your Eagles. You have talent. You want to always stay on script. It's like making Meryl Streep do improv. It's like, I'm sure she can do it, but that's not why you hire Meryl Streep. So I think that would be beneficial to Hurts. That's what Lincoln Riley did when he was at Oklahoma as well, was get a lot of stuff that moves across for him. And I think first and foremost, that's what he has to get to.
Yeah. Well, what you're describing, Nate, it kind of feels like the story of the playoffs right now. Like the offenses that are doing what you're describing are beating the more old school offenses, the siloed offenses, the ones that are just like, our guys are better than your guys. Green Bay versus Dallas being kind of the most emblematic game, I think, of that. And yeah, a team like Buffalo moving away from that. We'll see what Cincinnati does with Joe Burrow when they no longer have two, wide receivers who can dominate. It feels like Philadelphia has to move in that direction, but then they have to bring the quarterback with him. Yes. And he will be the quarterback. Yeah, he will be the quarterback next year. In fact, most of the players will be the same. And I think maybe we should wrap there. You and I have been talking about schematic changes they need to make. Yeah. From a personnel perspective, Jason Kelce, Hall of Fame center, is probably retiring. Otherwise, you're looking at pretty similar skill players. We'll see what they do at running back in particular. Is there anything that you think needs to be done from a personnel perspective to put this offense in a better situation next year?
That Jalen Hurts, I think, and this is be my critique of him, has to take a lot more ownership of the pre-snap process. Jason Kelce has been the quarterback of this operation as far as just handling protections and handling adjustments and everything. That's just, some offenses do that. We're going to put a lot on the center, but then we'll let the quarterback have a veto at the end if he sees something different. They wouldn't even do that, or at least Jalen would not use that, because it's like, hey, it's Jason Kelce. He's probably pretty good at sorting this stuff out. I just have the one last stat. I just dropped it, and it sounds arbitrary, but it kind of speaks to just what this offense became. Is against the blitz, A.J. Brown, he had 67 in-breaking routes against the blitz last year. This year, it was a third less. And that is, again, it's just one kind of microcosm of this entire offense that just became static. And nothing moved. Was that good word usage or not good?
No, I did. The disappearance of the AJ Brown inbreaker generally has befuddled me.
It dropped in by a third. It's like, why?
He's like literally one of the best wide receivers on deep in-breaking route. He was in Tennessee. What happened?
He's the yak monster. And that's what I've just been trying to figure out. It's like, are they asking him to do this for a reason? Or is, Hurts not seeing it? Or the plays not the same? The answer is yes to all of those. But now the formula is someone's got to take ownership, someone. And, I think it should be first and foremost, start with what the quarterback is comfortable with and just work from there. And I think it's going to be very interesting, the evolution that they try to change, because they need it.
All right, Nate. Well, I think that feels like a good place to stop, because you put together a pretty good offseason to-do list for Philadelphia. A lot of it is, I think, scheme-wise, modernizing the offense, but a lot of it also comes down to Jalen Hurts, coaching him up to solve some of the problems we've talked about. Eagles fans, however, I think if there's one piece of cope I can leave with you with, it's that your quarterback has a very proven history of improving, both in college and in the NFL. So let's hope that that's something that they continue to do. Nate, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the offense. Next, we're going to be joined by former Philadelphia Eagle defensive lineman, Super Bowl champ, two-time Super Bowl champ, host of the Green Light Pod, Chris Long, to talk about how Philadelphia can fix the defense. Okay, so that was the offense. I don't know if any of that will work, but we'll see. Unfortunately for Eagles fans, the defense was worse, just as bad, equally bad. Went from 3rd in DVOA in 2022 to 29th this season, particularly the second half of the season. You saw a collapse. I think, Chris, what makes it so hard, what made it for me so hard to talk about during the season was it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just one person. It was kind of everything. It was scheme. It was execution. It was personnel. So before we get into the sort of how to fix it of it all, from your perspective, obviously, given your background and your history with the team, you know them better than most. What struck you watching them as the single biggest problem?
I thought the single biggest problem was the personnel. Like, I do think, and you just finished offense, I don't know exactly what y'all said, but I think it was easy to look at that group and say, hey, there aren't pieces that are that much different from the team that came within a drop snap of beating the Kansas City Chiefs in a Super Bowl. The talent was not the issue there. I do think talent was an issue on defense. I don't know if they had the right coordinator, would they have been all right? And I think some things didn't break their way. I think they didn't see clearly where they were as an organization defensively going into the season. And I also think the scheme wasn't great. I mean, John Gannon, for as much crap as he caught for pew verticals and that sort of thing, like, I think what we found out is the guy can coach a little football, and the jury's out on him as a head coach. But it goes back to losing Avonte Maddox for me, and I'm not saying it's just about Maddox, but what I am saying is everything that came out of losing Maddox was really telling. Losing Maddox forced people into positions that they weren't ready to play. Losing Maddox made you dip more into the UDFA bag, into the guys off the street bag. At one point, they're starting, 5-6 different combinations of defensive backs for a great stretch of the season. And, when you got guys like Bradbury, who at one point was a heck of a player, and I say this with respect because it happens for all of us. And I think for defensive backs, when it comes to being able to run and losing a little bit of speed, it's harder, to play deep into your career as a veteran, especially if you're being asked to play out of position. I can remember games where Bradbury had to play slot. I can remember games very recently. I can remember plays very recently where Bradbury is asked to play man in key situations with no help over the top. The end of that Seattle game, I have no problem with going man in that situation, but with no safety help over the top, like, that guy's going to get beat. He's not a man corner. That's why he ended up where he is. I mean, like, if he were a man corner, he'd probably still be in New York or something like that. And, on the other side, you got Darius Slay, who, again, has been a really good player for Philly and for other teams in his career. But again, it's that aging defensive backfield in some spots. And I also think him getting scoped late in the year was a killer for them. The guys up front, I don't think they were as good as they were last year. I think last year was a little bit of a perfect storm, but not having the fractions of time to get there, as you know, can greatly tilt things away from a pass rush group. And the philosophical misstep, which has been made before in Philly, of neglecting the linebacker room and, not making it an area of importance. And you see TJ Edwards playing really well for the Bears. You let White walk. You had some injuries. Nakobe Dean's a guy you draft. Nakobe had injury issues coming in. That's something they've dealt with. You use a pick on Nolan Smith, and I'm not saying he's not going to be a good player. I like Nolan Smith, but maybe it's a thing where you don't know exactly where you are or how much you need to draft players that you can win with now and that are not developmental. So I think part of this snuck up on them. It's the perfect storm of not having the right answer, the personnel, the injuries, and it was ugly. And Desai had bad matchups. They played man a lot in key situations with bad matchups. And by the time Patricia's there to save the day, he's got Hassan dropping back in coverage, and you see some of the same issues. Yeah, I want to be fair to him because I don't think he's the answer, but I don't know who could have. Well, I don't know who could have fixed that group by the end of the year. The personnel was bad.
I think the personnel. You started off with the personnel was the problem, and there were coaching errors. I actually think the transition from Desai to Patricia was weird and bad and poorly handled and hugely backfired. I think, but ultimately. It was the personnel, but it was complicated. As you said, it was at all three levels for different reasons. And I agree with you that I think it really started in the secondary. It was like a combination of players who lost a step. And I think they knew that, by the way, because you remember it seemed like in the offseason, they weren't going to retain both Slay and Bradbury. And then things shook out. CJ Gardner-Johnson leaves. They end up keeping them.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. That was a big loss. And then I think, so it was a combination of players who were too old and then players who were too young. Also, like I would turn on Eagles games and be like, whoa, Eli Ricks is playing. Josh Jones. Like, it was just a bad mix. Before we get to the pressure aspect, linebacker also is something where, they let the veterans walk out the building and Kobe Dean gets hurt right away. So spinning this forward though, which of those, because I don't think they're the defensive line is where the money is invested, where the top draft picks invested in Jalen Carter and stuff. A lot there.
Yeah.
I think it's reasonable to expect he is going to, he tailed off a little bit towards the end of the season, but he's a very good football player. Hassan Reddick's still going to make a lot of money next year. I don't think pass rush, when we talk about, okay, how do you fix this? I don't think that's where you start. It's the back seven. Do you think that there's a position that they should prioritize? Whether it's free agency or the draft, or what do you think is the single most important position they need to get better at, given what we were just talking about?
I think corner is one of the most important positions in football, period. And it's reflected in how those guys are paid and what we think. Would I rather have an LOB type secondary or a fierce front, knowing that in either situation, you're going to have an inferior group on the back end or the front end, respectively? I would take the corners. I would take the people that can manipulate those fractions of time, because those, guys up front, you can get pretty good players that can win if you have a great secondary. When I played and I was on some teams where maybe we didn't have great defensive backfields, I was green with envy when I watched other teams and the time that guys had to get home. And you'd see above average players, coming up with big numbers because they played in a defense where you had a lockdown corner. I think if you're addressing defense, you have invested a lot in that front, and I don't think the returns have come up short. I'm not somebody who's saying what's wrong with Jordan Davis. I think Jordan Davis changes things for that group up front. I think Jalen Carter, he may not win Defensive Rookie of the Year because of stats. There's no rookie that showed me that person's going to be around for 10, 15 years more than Jalen Carter. That guy is a freaking beast. And, you're going to have to take the temperature of aging veterans up front. BG wants to be back. Do you want BG back? Does Fletcher Cox come back? Is he retiring? There are guys up front that you have to ask that question about, but I would first shore up the secondary. I really would. Yeah. And you can get linebackers from places that you don't have to invest heavily.
You don't have to invest heavily, but you certainly have to be better than you were this year. It's interesting how it kind of ended up being the downfall of both Dallas and Philly in the playoffs. And this is part of a longer conversation. I always do this, and I'm like, I'm going to do a giant pot on this, but I think I do truly believe off-ball linebacker has never been more important than it is in the NFL right now. Especially if you're in the NFC and you got to compete with the likes of San Francisco. You're just not going to beat this team without good off-ball linebackers. And especially and just given the way football is now, with all of the run action, the RPO stuff, the way teams target the middle of the field, you can't go into a season with the plan that Philly and Dallas, frankly, they had some injuries there too with Van Der Esch, did as well. So I think I agree with you, though. Corner is equally important. So it's going to come down to which free agents are available. Are there trades available? That's something that Howie Roseman's willing to do. Yeah, but it definitely feels like I think the front you can count on to get improvement there, and you've already got a lot invested there. It's really linebacker and corner, I think, where they got to invest.
You can draft a great linebacker somewhere, non-premium. You can find that guy that's going to play 5-7 years for you. It doesn't have to be in the top 10. I'm with you. I think in today's era of football, where everybody's coming off this West Coast tree and they've modernized it, and there's a lot of traffic and there's a lot of motion and there's a lot of manipulation of the eyes of the second level of defense. I just know you have to get those guys at a premium spot, whether it's in the draft or free agency. I think they can do both things this offseason, but you have to pick the right backer, right? Whether it's in the draft or in free agency, and build from there. Roquan Smith going to Baltimore, he's taken them, in my opinion, to the next level. And it's not just him. They got a great defense, but it's a situation where, somebody's saying, why would you give up all that for a backer? Mm-hmm. Well, that backer can be the thing that unlocks the whole defense.
Fix cornerback, fix linebacker. You heard it here first. And you heard it, by the way, from a defensive lineman. Like, you just broke former player protocol. You didn't say your position was important, the most important to fix.
Because I know who butters my bread, Mina, for 11 years, or who didn't butter my bread at times, was if you have a lockdown corner and you have those guys on the back end, it makes our job easier. And I do think they have enough talent up front.
Agree. Hard agree. All right. Chris Long, Super Bowl champion, podcaster at Greenlight. Check it out on YouTube as well. Thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully this was more upbeat for Eagles fans than 99.9% of the content you've been consuming over the last week.
Mina, thank you for having me on. Say hi to that beautiful baby boy.